Neil Armstrong and Edwin "Buzz" Aldrin's lunar landing on July 20th, 1969 marked one of the most memorable days in the history of the U.S. space industry. Although 10 more astronauts were sent to the moon in the following 3 years, no one has returned since December 14, 1972. Considering the successful journeys to the moon in the past, you might wonder why it's been 50 years since we've been back. Today we'll delve into the reasons behind NASA's decades-long absence from the moon. Enjoy the show. The end of the space race between the US and Russia. In 1955, a space race erupted between the Cold War rivals, the US and the Soviet Union. This race was an extension of the nuclear arms race that began after World War II. Both nations were determined to prove their technological superiority in the space industry. The competition, which started as a nuclear arms race, culminated in a power display with the development of rockets. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first satellite, Sputnik 1, and in 1961, they succeeded in sending Yuri Gagarin into space. This technology became a source of concern for U.S. officials, who were dedicated to achieving a greater victory. The only way to win this race was to develop rockets that could travel faster and higher, or to land on the moon. President John F. Kennedy knew that he couldn't allocate the necessary budget to NASA unless the moon was made a national priority. Therefore, he convened the Senate in 1962. This meeting took place at a time when the U.S. was trailing the Soviet Union in space development. The U.S. National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, despite the challenges, gathered the resources needed to make the big leap. In 1966, it received approximately 4.5% of the total federal budget, 10 times its current share. NASA's budget increase made it possible to land on the moon within 7 years through the Apollo program. For many, the space race ended with the Americans inflicting a crushing defeat on the Russians, so it seemed like there was no longer any competition worth fighting for. In 2019, Vice President of the National Space Council, Mike Pence, announced that NASA stated a possible return to the moon would be in 2028. Space policy advisor Casey Dreyer, however, said that no political authorization could provide financial support for the project. He went further, claiming that the only reason President John F. Kennedy allocated resources to Apollo was because he saw the program as a front in the Cold War. NASA first conducted the unmanned Apollo mission in 1966 and subsequently landed 12 people on the moon in 6 separate missions. The first mission began in July 1969, and the moon was reached with 5 additional Apollo missions in 1972. Undoubtedly, this journey remains one of NASA's greatest technological achievements. During these missions, astronauts conducted experiments that provided new scientific insights into the space industry. Each mission explored different aspects of the lunar surface. Rock samples were collected, flags were planted, and nuclear-powered vehicles continued to send data back to Earth, even though the human presence on the moon was short-lived. While the end of the space race might be a possible reason, there are other reasons why NASA never returned to the moon. The incredible dangers of moon travel. 2 major accidents occurred during the Apollo missions. The first was a fire on the launch pad of Apollo 1, resulting in the deaths of 3 astronauts. The second incident happened in the oxygen tank of Apollo 13. Fortunately, there were no casualties despite the explosion in the tank, and the astronauts returned safely to Earth. From that day on, the Apollo 13 mission came to be known as a successful failure. Besides these, there were reports that Neil Armstrong narrowly escaped death 14 months before the launch of Apollo 11. During a lunar landing training session, there was a problem with the spacecraft's engine, and the module exploded. If Armstrong hadn't left the spacecraft at the right time, he would have been torn to pieces in the accident. Reports also indicate that Neil Armstrong faced another near-death experience while landing Apollo 11. The assistance of U.S. Air Force meteorologist Hank Bradley was required for Apollo 11 to land safely in the Pacific Ocean. Thanks to an advanced satellite, Hank Bradley saw something resembling a severe storm in the spacecraft's re-entry path. With the help of high-ranking officers, he warned NASA about the impending threats. Thus, appropriate measures were taken to guide the spacecraft to a safe landing area. Apart from these issues, the dangerous nature of lunar dust, being completely deprived of sunlight for up to 14 days, the extreme heat experienced when exposed to sunlight, and the possibility of asteroids colliding with astronauts are among the dangers of moon travel. Still, could these be sufficient reasons for NASA not to return to the moon? Don't decide until you hear the other reasons. Travel expenses. One of the reasons why NASA hasn't returned to the moon is the incredibly high cost of the journey. Although the Kennedy administration allocated a budget of approximately $7 billion for the program, NASA's expenditures exceeded $20 billion. For instance, the Apollo project cost $25.8 billion, which translates to about $264 billion in today's money. With the support of over 20,000 companies and universities, a total of more than 400,000 people contributed to the successful launch of the program. In the following years, former U.S. President Richard Nixon, who took over, expressed serious concerns about the project due to the enormous costs. He stated that no reason could justify returning to the moon, especially considering the danger and expense, and that only competition and economy could make this journey a valid endeavor. Former NASA Deputy Administrator Lori Garver referred to times when Congress and the industry were more interested in the program's initiation than its sustainability. In the 80s, President Ronald Reagan declared the International Space Station, formerly known as the Freedom Space Station, a space center with an initial price tag of $8 billion. However, with the International Space Station program becoming an international project in 2010, the total cost soared above $100 billion. Of course, as the scope of any project increases, the cost inevitably rises. But when it comes to the International Space Station, NASA was expected to deliver a more efficient project. However, there was another problem. The space industry was seeking a faster, cheaper, and more efficient rocket. The SLS rocket used in the Artemis mission couldn't offer the expected advantages as it's an expendable vehicle, not a reusable one. After each successful launch, the rocket's core stage and side boosters ended up in the ocean. The good news is that Elon Musk's SpaceX company is building Starship, a reusable rocket, to make space travel more affordable and efficient. Unlike the SLS, which has cost over $23 billion so far, the project has cost $5 billion to date. However, SpaceX has to prove that its new rocket has the capabilities to succeed in the Artemis program. Currently, the only rocket NASA can use to send to the moon seems to be the SLS on the launch pad. If launched successfully, the rocket will boost the US's technological power. On the other hand, a potential failure will cause a significant setback for the government. Garver stated that if a new test flight were conducted, no launches could be carried out for the next 2 years. It's truly a tough decision, isn't it? Government change. Continuity in government change is essential for a democratic society. On the other hand, each government coming to power with its own goals and principles has negatively impacted NASA's plans and objectives. Each government's focus on projects with shorter completion times has led to the neglect of the space program. These administrative changes naturally made it difficult to commit to projects that outlasted a two-term president. One of these was the project to return to the moon. For example, in 2004, George W. Bush's directive to NASA to develop a replacement for the space shuttle brought the Constellation program under the Space Exploration Initiative into the agenda. With this program at NASA, astronauts could be landed on the moon with a rocket and a spacecraft known as Ares and Orion. Although $9 billion was spent on the space program in 5 years, the plan did not bear fruit. After taking office, President Barack Obama canceled the program, citing NASA's inability to estimate the cost of the Constellation program. He stated that the program exceeded the budget by billions of dollars and was years behind where it should be. After shelving the Constellation program, he approved the SLS rocket and directed NASA to send its astronauts to a near-Earth asteroid to prepare them for a series of journeys to Mars. Thus, the moon mission was also put aside. NASA handed over the development of the SLS to Boeing. The rocket, which was expected to be made from recycled material and be a cost-effective vehicle, turned out to be an expensive and delayed endeavor. Therefore, its positive aspects were disregarded, and it became a subject of mockery as the Senate rocket. Had it launched successfully, it would have been the first spacecraft designed by NASA since the Space Shuttle's debut in 1981. When President Donald Trump took office, he embraced the SLS but canceled Obama's 2017 plans to send astronauts to an asteroid. Instead, he prioritized Moon and Mars missions, putting NASA back on its original course. He also wanted to use Artemis to return astronauts to the Moon in 2024 and establish a long-term sustainable human presence, corresponding to NASA's initial 2028 goal. With this decision, he convened Congress and requested an additional budget of $1.6 billion for the project, but his request was not fulfilled. The financial impacts and frequent changes led to the cancellation of several programs NASA aimed for and a heavy loss amounting to billions of dollars. The changes also caused a loss of time and interest. Since the time of John F. Kennedy, no president has been able to successfully finance the plan to return to the moon. Just as a new space journey was about to begin, the government changed, a new president took over, and the planned flights were canceled. However, the current U.S. President, Joe Biden, seems to be continuing Trump's Artemis priority. Earlier this year, he requested a $6.8 billion increase from Congress for the Artemis program, totaling $7.5 billion. He also refused to compromise with the Space Force. Structural errors. Apollo 17 was the last mission to the moon, and Eugene Cernan was the last person to walk on its surface. One of the reasons NASA refuses to return to the moon is some technological obstacles. The constant problems with the rockets being built made the journey an extremely unreasonable risk. For example, the launch of the SLS has been repeatedly delayed due to setbacks encountered. In April 2022, a faulty valve and hydrogen leak were discovered during a test to fill and then empty the rocket with fuel. NASA Inspector General Paul Martin placed the responsibility on Boeing, which built the SLS, due to poor planning and execution. It's also worth remembering that NASA last tested its lunar rocket in November 1967. In that test, Saturn V made its first flight. A report published by NASA in the 1970s revealed that Apollo 4 achieved success within 7 years with input from tens of thousands of employees in government, industry, and universities. It took a few more years for the SLS to reach the launch pad. The idea that the moon is a death trap. Many people suggest that there are problems beyond changing governments and flawed rockets, claiming that the moon poses serious risks to astronauts. This raises the question of whether the risk is worth taking. The surface of our 4.5 billion-year-old satellite is riddled with craters and rocks that seriously threaten safe landings. That's why the US government spent billions of dollars mapping the surface and researching potential landing sites before astronauts landed on the moon in 1969. Another concern is the environmental impact of lunar space. Moon dust, also known as regolith, undergoes electrostatic charge buildup due to its interaction with the solar wind. Thus, sharp dust particles stick to the surfaces they land on, including astronauts' lungs, posing a life-threatening risk if exposed for long periods. The Apollo missions were also affected by this, and astronauts stayed in space for shorter durations than initially thought. Therefore, to spend longer periods in space and build permanent habitats, this challenge needs to be addressed. Furthermore, the moon's surface is exposed to scorching temperatures for about 14 days due to its phases. In the following phase, it becomes completely dark, making it a target for freezing cold for another 14 days, and this cycle continues as the phases occur. The reason for these extreme temperature changes is the moon's lack of a protective atmosphere. NASA is currently developing a power system to enable astronauts to overcome the dark period by providing them with electricity. Additionally, spacesuits and rovers have already been designed to be resistant to the sun and dust, supporting longer missions to lunar space. However, it's not yet clear if the equipment is ready for launch. If the moon is so dangerous, why not send robots there instead of humans? The answer lies in Buzz Aldrin's response. There's no doubt that robots have done wonderful things in the name of science, but human contribution is invaluable and unpredictable. Aldrin also experienced something with Neil Armstrong on Apollo 11. He said that when they returned to their module from the lunar surface, they took off their helmets, and the entire cabin filled with the smell of moon dust. Aldrin, who likened the smell to burnt coal and the odor in the air after a fireworks show, said, "No robot can tell you that the moon has a smell." Nevertheless, there are also theories that giant and dangerous aliens are lurking around the moon. There are rumors that some astronauts return to Earth with alien samples currently held in top-secret laboratories. To be honest, their existence there would mean we're not the only civilization in the universe. It seems like it's better not to mess with them if we don't want to experience a real Star Wars scenario. Do you think NASA astronauts will be able to walk on the moon again? Could traces of life be found on our satellite in a journey made with today's technology? You can share your thoughts with us in the comments. See you in the next videos. Goodbye.